Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the panel. It's on the truth about the attacks on teaching critical race theory in public schools. Thank you for dropping into our presentation today. I also want to thank the staff at Netroots Nation. This is my 11th Netroots Nation, and I'm always impressed with this event. The people who throw this do a great job every year. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Progressive magazine, for supporting this panel. Since 1909, the Progressive has been a prominent platform for amplifying the progressive grassroots and those who are underrepresented in our society. My name is Jeff Bryant. I'm a writing fellow at the Independent Media Institute and the chief correspondent for Our Schools, which is IMI's education project. I'm also managing editor for Public Schools Advocate, which is the education project of the Progressive magazine. I'm here today with three distinguished panelists, who I'll introduce later, to talk about these news stories we're seeing across the nation about enraged mobs swarming school board meetings, threatening educators, and alleging that public school teachers are indoctrinating students in Marxist ideology and teaching them to discriminate against white people. Along with these heated attacks on public schools and teachers, lawmakers in at least 28 states and in the US Congress have considered or enacted new laws that disrupt or block schools and teachers from teaching about issues of race and gender in American and history and society. What's going on here, and why should progressives care? Before I turn to our three panelists to delve into the details, I want to outline 5 key understandings about these attacks that I think we ought to agree on before we go further in the discussion. First, we should consider on January 6th in Washington, D.C., when enraged Trump supporters stormed the nation's capital to overthrow the results of the 2020 presidential election. Many observers correctly labeled the event as domestic terrorism and an assault on democracy. Like the assault on the nation's capital, the storming of school boards by enraged conservatives and new laws targeting school teachers are also acts of political extremism. They are attacks on democracy. But instead of seeking to undermine an election, the goal here is to undermine an institution that is fundamental to our democracy, public schools. In a recent letter to President Joe Biden, the National School Boards Association, a group that is representing local school boards, asked the federal government to review violence and threats against schools to see if they violate federal statutes about domestic terrorism and hate crimes. The Biden administration seems to be complying with this request. Earlier this week, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland said that the FBI will work on countering threats against educators and school board members. Also, the U.S. Department of Justice will create a task force to consider how to address individuals and groups that harass and attack educators and school officials. The second thing I think we all ought to understand is that enraged groups showing up at school board meetings and accusing teachers of indoctrination may have the appearance of being grassroots and parent-led, but they aren't. They are actually highly organized and extremely well-funded. According to an analysis by NBC News, at least 165 local and national groups provide organizational support and financial backing for the protesters. Most of these groups are connected to well-funded think tanks and political organizations of the radical right wing. Some of these names will probably be familiar to you, like the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, the Goldwater Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Koch family foundations, and the Manhattan Institute. Right-wing advocacy groups that appear to be organized from the ground up that really aren't, such as Parents Defending Education, Moms for Liberty, No Left Turns in Education, the Independent Women's Network, the Legal Insurrection Foundation. These organizations are actually funded by billionaires. The third thing I think we ought to understand is that a common refrain in these protests is that schools are indoctrinating students in a concept known as critical race theory, or CRT. That charge is absurd. First, CRT, a legal concept from academia, is not being taught in K-12 schools. And the organizers of these outraged mobs offer no critique of the actual substance of CRT. Instead, CRT is being used as a symbol to activate long-standing fears related to the country's increasing racial and gender diversity. And CRT is being wielded as a code word meant to frighten people about the prospect of marginalized citizens participating more openly in society. It's no coincidence, for instance, that districts where there have been some of the most combative debates over diversity and inclusion, such as Gwinnett County, Georgia, and Loudoun County, Virginia, these are places that have had a steady increase of students of color attending their schools. It's also telling that the people enraged at schools for teaching children to be critical thinkers and engaged learners are the same people opposing efforts to vaccinate people against COVID and opposed to requiring school staff and students to wear masks. They are the same cabal attacking election officials who want to make it easier for marginalized communities to vote. This confluence of anti-masking with efforts to rid schools of teaching the truth about structural racism is where American libertarianism meets white supremacy. It seeks to deny people the chance to be active participants in civic life, including the ability to vote. The fourth understanding I'd like to put out there is that the short-term political objectives of these attacks on public schools and school teachers are clearly to mobilize a partisan base for the 2022 and 2024 elections. Right-wing radicals such as Breitbart founder and Donald Trump advisor Steve Bannon have branded the campaign against schools and teachers as, quote, the Tea Party of the 10th power. But there's a longer-term goal that must be understood. As Duke University professor Nancy McLean explains in her book, Democracy in Chains, the right-wing movement has been trying to dismantle public education, or at least cripple it to the point of dysfunction, for a generation. They perceive a public school system that allows people from different backgrounds to come together and share varying points of view to be a threat to white patriarchal rule. Public schools are, after all, one of the few, if not the only places where people are brought together in a common space that reveals their differences and engages them in sharing these differences and coming to mutual understandings about them. If that can somehow be framed as negative by attacking what schools do, then the right wing is one step closer to getting rid of public education. Finally, this current state of affairs will likely inflict deep and lasting harm to school children. When students see grown adults, sometimes their own parents, hurling insults at school boards and threatening teachers, they are learning a dangerous lesson about how to engage in civic discourse. When education officials are being pressured to remove certain topics and subjects from school curricula, students are getting a narrow and less engaging learning experience. When teachers are being intimidated from acknowledging the diversity of their students and the community that surrounds them, marginalized students feel less welcome and less nurtured in their classrooms. When conflicting points of view are purged from public education, those conflicts will spill over into other arenas for students later in their lives, become adults whose views have become more resistant to change because they never experienced real diversity of thought during their formative years. Now, with those five understandings in mind, I want to turn the discussion over to my fellow panelists. First, we're going to hear from Beth Glenn. Beth is a visiting scholar at the New York University Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. She is also a policy and strategy consultant with Journey for Justice. Journey for Justice is a network of grassroots organizations in over 30 states opposing zero tolerance policies and opposing the privatization of public schools. Next, we'll hear from Catherine Dunn. Catherine is the director of the Advancement Project's Opportunity to Learn campaign, which supports campaigns across the country to fight for quality education and end the school to prison pipeline. Prior to joining the Advancement Project, Catherine served as the regional policy analyst, at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where she led that organization's children's rights policy work. Last, we'll hear from Jesse Hagopian. Jesse teaches ethnic studies at Garfield High School in Seattle. He is an organizer with Black Lives Matter at School. Jesse is the co-editor of the book Teaching for Black Lives and editor of the book More Than a Score, the new uprising against high-stakes testing. He is also a recipient of the 2013 Secondary School Teacher of the Year Award. Each panelist will present for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll try to have as much as 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please submit your questions to the chat feature to the right of the screen, and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. So next up, Beth, take it away.
You are still muted.
So sorry, I was still muted. All right. So again, thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon, everybody. I am Beth Glenn. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming from the Koch Tank in Piscataway lands, also known as Washington, D.C. I'm going to discuss some trends in education that are fueling these attacks, including the changing student demographics in public schools, the needs to address these changes in curricula and pedagogy, and how these attacks fit into the long struggle by communities of color against racism and for equity and justice in education, as well as other social systems. So since 2019, the majority of US students have been students of color, and that trend is only expected to accelerate. By 2043, the majority of all people in this country is projected to reflect the global majority, with fewer than half of Americans identifying as white. Hence, you have racists with tiki torches at their murderous march in Charlottesville, Virginia, chanting, quote, "You will not replace us," unquote. And the idea of white replacement theory has been repopularized, slithering from neo-Nazi sympathizer corners of the dark web into the minds and mouths of Capitol insurrectionists on January 6th. Now, ironically, one of the central tenets of CRT is that whenever there's advancement toward racial equity, there will be backlash, often violent and disproportionate to the original gains. Recent progressive victories in education include districts like New York City, where parent and community groups fought for and won anti-racism training for all staff in the nation's largest school district. They followed that up with winning a culturally responsive curriculum initiative. Meanwhile, this spring, California approved the nation's first statewide ethnic studies curriculum for high schools. Los Angeles and Oakland passed budget initiatives designed specifically to redress the harm done to Black and Brown communities through disinvestment in schools. And all this is happening in the shadow of the George Floyd murder and the publicized murders of far too many other unarmed Black people. Protesters spent last summer in the streets and quickly proceeded to school boards to demand that districts defund school policing, redirect those funds toward academic, mental health, and social supports for students of color. Now, because of racism, the policing presence and practices were often heaviest in Black and Brown communities. So they stood to gain the greatest monetary and psychological benefits from redirecting funds away from policing. Also fresh in recent memory is an upwelling of sympathy and a federal protection law following increasing attacks against Asian Americans. This violence was catalyzed by pandemic demagoguery and lies which spilled into our classrooms. Schools responded to reports of bullying, intimidation, and harassment of Asian students with a greater interest in learning about diverse communities and learning about how this current violence was an outgrowth of the violent racist impulse throughout our history. These perceived gains by students and families from marginalized communities and schools, less policing, more inclusive curriculum, more equitable resources, were met with swift backlash, both overt and covert. Many school boards rolled back pledges to eliminate police or replace them with private security. Right-wing lawmakers are trying to amend the California ethnic studies law with language designed to chill the discussion of race and racism. School districts like Detroit, Michigan, which serve mostly students of color and are already targeted for disinvestment by right-wing state lawmakers and governors, are being threatened with even further defunding. And these same regressive governors and legislatures want to extend vouchers to families made uncomfortable by teaching the truth. Now, where do vouchers come in? They also serve as a method of undermining public schools in diverse communities by starving them of funding. And the damage is felt most acutely by the students who are left behind. You cannot heat a school building 1 degree less for every student lost to a voucher. You can't turn on one less light and leave their other classmates in the dark. Instead, school leaders have to make cuts to the labs and libraries of students whose families can't afford private school tuition, usually far and above the size of a voucher. So again, those with less, too often communities of Black and brown kids get the least. And this threat to remove resources from schools serving the advancement of communities of color is a through line in our nation's history. As Jeff noted, public schooling has been a bedrock of our democracy and one of the few mostly universally shared experiences in our nation. It has also been intimately tied with race. Enslavers knew the power of education to perpetuate racism when they made it illegal to teach Black people to read. The federal government and religious institutions wielded education in service of racism by creating Indian boarding schools. The very idea of universal public schooling only came about in response to demands from formerly enslaved Black communities and campaigns of segregation, disinvestment, massive resistance, firing Black teachers, the school to prison pipeline, and school privatization have just continued the racist assaults on schools and learning. Now the attacks against any initiatives promoting equity or discussing how racism functions are just the latest attempts to make sure schools continue to prop up white discrimination and inequity. Another tenet of CRT is that racism grows and changes in response to historical conditions. The false anti-CRT fight is a reaction against the beneficial and necessary adjustments schools have to make to serve a changing population in a more diverse and developed world. Instead, CRT antagonists would rather education continue to be a roadblock against fairness and justice. Now, my next point may be a bit academic, but the attack on CRT is an attack on what we actually consider knowledge and the right of people of color to contribute knowledge and have their knowledge taken seriously. It emerged from Black law professors and their students of Native, Hispanic, Chicano, and Asian descent. It emerged from them not seeing themselves in the law and studies of how that law functioned. By now, CRT's tenets have been applied to a host of other disciplines, but when I first heard them, they sounded really like what my grandparents taught me. Racism is normal and systemic in this country. The United States was founded on the theft of land and labor. Race is culturally invented and fluid, not biological or fixed. Laws and policies have preserved the unequal treatment of people of color on the basis of race. And all this sounds like wisdom passed on at many Black and brown kitchen tables. At base, the race is fighting to prevent anti-racist teaching and exploration of such concepts cannot stand for ideas arising from communities of color to be codified, to become conventional wisdom, and to eventually influence law and policy. They would rather preserve the narrow, jingoistic view of the world which they learned in school. To perpetuate that is to perpetuate white hegemony and discrimination by censoring the experiences of people that they deem other. Be clear, all these are efforts to preserve racism, to back change, and innovate the body politic, laying the groundwork for minority rule in advance of a rapidly diversifying nation and world. Thanks, everyone. Happy to answer your questions. I believe Catherine's up next.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Beth, and thanks to Netroots Nation for hosting this conversation. It's great to be with y'all today. As Jeff said, I'm Director of Advancement Project's Opportunity to Learn program, where we fight for education justice by supporting campaigns across the country, led by Black and Brown young people to ensure quality education for all children and to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. Our theory of change is rooted in building power for people of color and directly and effectively dismantling structural racism. We use law, policy, strategic communications, and organizing strategies in partnership with communities in our work towards racial justice. So the totality of our work is a direct reckoning with our past, naming how it impacts our present, and reimagining a future where Black people and other people of color are truly free. In our work, we see the fights over critical race theory in our schools as an effort to divide and distract us from addressing real problems in our society. Beth talked a little bit about this. In the last several years, we have had cultural and political breakthroughs on how people understand systemic racism and what they can do to change it. This is not to say that we don't still have a long way to go, but we are on the winning path. And that means that the status quo and centralized conservative power is being threatened and dismantled. So they want to do everything possible to stop this shift and to retain their power. And these attacks are part of a broad, coordinated effort to thwart a multiracial democracy. The timing of the attacks on critical race theory is both revealing and predictable. These fights are happening at a time when young people have spent the past year and a half enduring a global pandemic, virtual learning, police violence, and racial uprisings. In fact, approximately 140,000 children have lost a parent or guardian due to COVID, and our schools need real resources to support students through the trauma they have experienced. Black and Brown young people have been disproportionately impacted. Even before COVID, our normal was unjust and unacceptable, including drastically underfunded Black and Brown schools that are more subject to privatization and takeover by states or cities. Schools where Black and Brown students lack access to the same rigorous coursework as white students. About half of districts have basic infrastructure issues, a particular concern during this pandemic when they need resources to update or replace multiple systems like heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, even plumbing. And then millions of students attend schools with police, but without counselors, nurses, psychologists, or social workers. So the consequences of normal are an education system that oppresses, polices, arrests, and pushes millions of students out of schools each year, disproportionately Black and Brown youth. And these issues really are symptoms of the systemic racism that results in undemocratic and under-resourced Black and Brown schools. And that's why young people have been demanding change in their schools and in their communities for years. So following the murder of George Floyd, communities were forced to grapple with the reality that the police who target, terrorize, and kill Black and Brown people on the streets are the same police in schools with our children. In the year that has followed, we've seen historic progress resulting from these years of struggle. These included wins to remove police from schools in Oakland, Denver, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, and Madison, among others. We've actually seen over 35 school districts take steps to end policing in their hallways, and federal legislation introduced to end federal funding of police in schools. So as young people have led fights to create real change in their schools, among progress in other areas of society, we see these attacks on CRT emerge, along with fights about mask mandates, all part of the same strategy as Jeff talked about in the opening. Again, this timing is revealing, but it is also predictable. It's an old fight with new language. Beth and Jeff have noted it's a fear-mongering tactic to motivate their base and to stop any progress on our end. Fights for more inclusive curriculum in schools are decades old. Today's fight echoes previous attempts to stifle Chicano studies and Mexican American history programs that focused on racism and discrimination against Chicanos, the racialization of U.S. immigration policies, and the treatment of undocumented workers in the 1970s, when the Chicano power movement was gaining momentum under young Chicano leaders. Chicano students in East LA organized mass student walkouts protesting the lack of quality education, unsatisfactory conditions in their schools, police brutality, and other forms of state violence. Conservative backlash followed quickly as these fights for inclusion of Chicano studies in school curriculum gained traction. It also resulted in increase of policing students in schools, as we document in our history of school policing on our website, policefreeschools.com. Over the past year, more and more students have participated in racial uprisings and examining systemic racism in their schools and communities, including in police-free schools fights. And we now see a similar backlash against anti-racist studies. These fights clearly serve a broader purpose beyond stopping the use of anti-racist curriculum or any talk of race in schools. They are part of a strategy to undermine public schools with the goal of eventually dismantling them. We've been fighting these tactics for a long time too. Beth talked about the changing demographics in this country. And as students of color became a majority, first region of the country where they became a majority was the South, and that was in 2009. At that time, we saw a wave of private school voucher programs enacted in the region in the early 2010s. Modern day white flight that has led to devastating underfunding of our public schools in the region, further segregation in the region, and discrimination in those private voucher schools. So similarly, these CRT fights build on these privatization efforts and are now concentrated in districts with majority students of color, the same districts that are disproportionately under-resourced. The goal is to continue to undermine and then push privatization, and you can see that in who is funding these attacks and this overarching strategy, the Koch brothers, Walton Foundation, etc. The reality is that our partners, including in the National Campaign for Police-Free Schools, have been leading fights to end the physical, emotional, and intellectual policing of students in schools. These fights include demands for anti-racist training of educators and staff, culturally affirming curricula, because these resources are not actually often available in our schools, as much as this misinformation campaign would have us believe otherwise. And they include demands for investments in resources that support the whole child, including social emotional resources, hiring professionals with training in health and mental health supports, alternatives for safety that do not include police, like school-based violence interrupters, and restorative and transformative justice. While many schools and districts are moving in the direction of progress to be places where students can truly learn and thrive, we can't lose focus of the fights our young people are leading, as is clearly the goal of those seeking to distract and disarm us away from progress towards a multiracial democracy and instead into reactive mode. We know that the world that young people are fighting for is possible, and so do those who are clearly afraid of this vision. Our responsibility is to live up to the dreams and imagination of our young people who can see beyond the status quo and envision a new liberatory education system. I'm so excited to hear next from Jesse and then to get into discussion with y'all. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine and Beth. It's so great to be in this struggle with you all. And my name is Jesse Hagopian. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I am on occupied Duwamish territory in the city of Seattle, named after a Duwamish chief. And yet, because of the broken Treaty of Point Elliott, the Duwamish people still don't have federal recognition, right? And check this out. If I was in one of the 11 states that bans the teaching of critical race theory or is trying to limit anti-racist teaching, right, I could actually face censure for pointing out that the U.S. has systematically broke treaties with Native nations over and over again, right? And there are 11 states now where they are trying to make it illegal to teach the truth to children. We're talking about Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Utah, all have laws trying to curb anti-racist teaching. And to date, some 28 states have introduced this legislation and it's pending, right? And these laws really are aimed at trying to require educators to lie to students about structural racism and other forms of oppression, sexism, heterosexism, right? And they're attacking the 1619 Project, the Zen Education Project that I do work for, and the Black Lives Matter at School movement that I've helped organize with as well. And, you know, we're seeing, I think, a shift now from the right-wing strategy in where they for a long time would deny that anything in the past had anything to do with the present. So the period of enslavement, they would say, happened such a long time ago, get over it. Jim Crow, segregation, they said happened such a long time ago. Okay, my dad lived through that era, but okay. They said now we live in colorblind utopia, and those past situations have nothing to do with today. Now the right wing is just trying to say that those periods didn't happen at all, I guess, right? And I think the boundless satire that is the United States of America is revealed once again by the fact that Juneteenth becomes a federal holiday, right? The commemoration of the ending of slavery becomes a federal holiday at the same moment when it's becoming illegal to teach about it in many places. And you just see the refrain of the land of the free just continuing to take on new and intricate shades of mockery in this country. And I think quite paradoxically, the laws outlawing critical race theory confirms the central claim of critical race theory, right? That racism is embedded in the law, even when it appears to have race-neutral language. So I think many of these bills directly state that they want to ban the teaching that the United States is, quote, fundamentally racist or sexist. And if you just look up the definition of fundamental in Merriam-Webster, they say it means serving as an original or generating source, right? And given that the original source of our country was the genocide of Native American people and the enslavement of African people, you literally can't teach the truth about the founding of this country without talking about systemic racism. And hell, with these laws, you can't even teach an honest account of the US Constitution, which I find ironic because you would think that the right wing would want us to teach about the founding documents of this country. But the Constitution claimed that Black people were 3/5 of a human being. So am I really not allowed to even teach now the founding documents? Well, I'll tell you how I teach about the Constitution in my classrooms. I do a lesson where we go back in time, and the students actually get to participate in the Constitutional Convention. But we actually invite people who were never originally invited to the Constitutional Convention. So we invite women to participate in the Constitutional Convention. We invite Native Americans to participate, and we invite Black people to participate in the Constitutional Convention. And then the students learn that, in fact, originally it was mostly white men slaveholders who wrote the Constitution. And the students compare the Constitution that they created with the original Constitution, and through that kind of critical thinking, examine why we have such great inequities in our society today. And, these are the types of lessons that they don't want to happen in schools across this country. A teacher in Tennessee, Matthew Hahn, was fired from his job for assigning a Ta-Nehisi Coates essay and a poem by Kayla Janae Lacey about white privilege. In Florida, Amy Dorofono was fired from her job because she had a Black Lives Matter flag in her classroom. Teachers in my own home state, where there is no bill, there's no pending bill, have faced many threats. Right? There was a teacher in the Tri-Cities area who had physical threats made against her life. And this is happening to hundreds of teachers around the country. And that's why we are building the hashtag Teach Truth movement. And the Zen Education Project launched that hashtag last spring with a day of action on June 12th, and then partnered with Black Lives Matter at School and the African American Policy Forum to launch a weekend of action at the end of August, where hundreds of educators and students and parents around the country rallied at historic sites that revealed something about the Black freedom struggle or about structural racism or other forms of oppression in their communities. And this is part of a long struggle for the right to access to education that Beth spoke to earlier, right? But my family was enslaved on plantations in Morgantown, Mississippi, and in New Orleans. And as Beth said, it was illegal for them to read and write. The first laws of this kind were enacted in 1740 in the wake of the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, right? And these laws made it an illegal activity for enslaved people to read and write. And, you know, despite those laws, Black people snuck off plantations and taught each other to read and write in a practice called stealing a meeting, right? Even though the punishment could be maiming, whippings, or even death. And during the Reconstruction era, Black people built the public school system. Formerly enslaved Black folks built the public school system that was of great benefit to poor white people as well. People like Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History helped lead the struggle for Black studies in K-12 schooling and founded Negro History Week, which became Black History Month. And during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black freedom struggle built the Freedom Summer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee starting freedom schools, more than 3,000 Black folks attending those schools. And you had the Black Panther Party's liberation schools. And really, this is the continuation of that work today to fight back against these racist bills. And it isn't just the teachers who are being fired or being threatened that's the problem. It's also educators who are turning away from this work for fear of the repercussions. So a friend of mine in Iowa, who's part of Black Lives Matter at school, revealed that in her school, more teachers, because of the uprising of 2020, were increasingly including diverse texts. And one teacher wanted to add Alice Walker's short story, The Flowers, to the curriculum, a story about a Black girl who comes across a body who is presumably lynched, a Black man. And after these laws passed in Iowa, the teacher didn't feel safe teaching this book anymore and had to put it back on the shelf, right? This is what's happening in hundreds or thousands of classrooms around the country. And it's time that we take a stand, because one of the primary ways that the billionaire class maintains its power has always been through controlling what is acceptable knowledge and enforcing what Professor Henry Giroux has called the violence of organized forgetting. And the current attacks on critical race theory, on ethnic studies, on critical pedagogy is not just antics or distractions from the real issues, as I hear too often from liberals, but I think instead we have to understand it as epistemicide, really the killing or silencing or annihilation of entire systems of knowledge. So today's struggle for Black studies and ethnic studies really goes beyond education. It's about whether a multiracial democracy is still even a goal espoused in our society. It's a struggle over whether we are going to return to the hysteria and paranoia of the McCarthy era. And it's a struggle over whether the past will be continued to remembered at all, or whether it will finally be thrown down the memory hole in service of maintaining white supremacy and the concentration of power in the hands of a tiny minority. So I just want to end by saying that today's racists aren't so bold as to ban the reading of the word like they did to my ancestors, but they do want to ban the reading of the world, as Paulo Freire put it, and try to stop students from understanding our society so that they can change it. And finally, I think to go out with the words of Septima Clark are really important at this time when she said, "I believe unconditionally of the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm." And I urge everybody on October 14th to join with Black Lives Matter at School and the African American Policy Forum and other endorsers like the National Education Association. Join us in a national uprising on October 14th, where educators across the country will be teaching lessons about structural racism. And everybody's encouraged to wear a Black Lives Matter at School shirt that day that you can get on our website. And parents can have virtual field trips to civil rights museums with their students. There's ways for everybody to participate in this day so that we all are joining the side of the Black freedom struggle today against this racist backlash. Thank you so much.
That was tremendous. Really, this kind of shared wisdom is one of the things I just love about Netroots Nation. And I find it very exhilarating. I find it very exciting. So I think about these kinds of struggles as opportunities. I think the last time I saw education in the center of these intersectional battles to the extent that it is right now was when teachers had their walkouts in 2018 and 2019. If you don't recall that right off the bat, it was a nationwide wave of teacher walkouts, protesting the conditions in their schools and their work conditions. I saw people, because of those walkouts, getting involved in education advocacy in a way that I've never seen before. And if you recall, many of those walkouts successfully led to increased funding in schools. One thing we've been talking about in our time together, more respect for teachers. Teachers actually rose in terms of favorability because of those strikes. So I'm seeing this battle that we face today also as an opportunity. And I would like the three panelists to talk about who are our allies in this opportunity. Where are there places that we should be reaching out and making connections with people? And I'll just put that out there for all three of you to talk about.
So a good place, I think, to start, and I was just looking for the information. We're trying to find a link for you to the October 14th Day of Action that Jesse referenced. And I mean, the organizations that he listed, the African American Policy Forum, Black Lives Matter at School, the Zen Education Project. You know, these people have been doing this fantastic work. They've put together toolkits where you can educate folks around what CRT is and isn't, and make some of this background visible to them. I worked with a coalition that includes AAPF through the Metro Center to come up with with the toolkit that I mentioned, and it's got sample talking points and what do you call them? PowerPoints, and everything that you would need to know to start catalyzing this discussion in your communities, because those are really the allies that we have and that we need, and that people in school need. I mean, there are lots of well-meaning public officials and elected school board members who need to hear public support, because all they're hearing is the loud voices of the small minority of people who are creating this false fight and this false issue. And so we really need to ally together with all the working class people, like Jesse said, that are the descendants of the folks who got together with Black workers and indentured and white indentured servants and had the Stono Rebellion that led to passing these laws that said Black people can't learn how to read. So the same energy that got those working class people together is the same energy that needs to band that we need to use to band together with educators, with elected school board officials and other public officials to push back against this right-wing attempt to protect the billionaires and the elites and the wealthy by keeping us from knowing about each other and learning about each other, and keeping us from pushing back against this kind of erasure and, attempt to keep us from learning about how race and racism functions in our country.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think social justice unionism is such an important concept in how we're going to defeat these racist bills and build a movement, not just to stop these bills, but to transform education. Because even before these bills, our schools weren't doing a very good job in teaching for Black lives, right? And so our schools really need a complete transformation in terms of being places to help students understand the problems that exist in society and help them find collective solutions to those problems, rather than places that are used to rank and sort them into a low-wage economy, right? And so we need educators to collectively act in their unions, but to fuse the power of labor with the power in the community and the power of social movements like Black Lives Matter, like the immigrant rights struggle, like women's struggles, and come together in a common struggle. And I think that when that has happened throughout history, it has been an incredible force. I mean, look at where social movement unionism came from, the term deriving from the struggle in South Africa. And it was the fusing of Black youth in the streets in the Black consciousness movement against apartheid with the power of COSATU and the labor unions there in South Africa that were able to bring down the apartheid regime, right? And it was when the consciousness was raised by the young people, and then the workers shut down the most profitable sector of the economy, that was able to bring these racists to their knees, right? And we need to employ those strategies, bring together working people in collective struggle aligned with social movements.
Yeah. I mean, there's an echo. I'm not sure why, but hopefully it's not bad for those listening in. +1 to everything Beth and Jesse have said this whole time, and in response to this question, I would just underscore the, work across sectors, like not being siloed in this moment. I think we've highlighted how these CRT fights are an effort to distract from attempts to privatize public education, but they're broader attacks to thwart a multiracial democracy, right? And so we see voter suppression bills in almost every single state, and we know that there are people focused on protecting our voting rights, but making sure that we are not fighting these fights separately, that we are coming together and understanding really what they're doing is attempting to silo us and to separate and distract us in these fights.
I think Jesse's point in reference to apartheid is so critical. And I would just like to kind of piggyback on that for a second by saying that if you recall, the student rebellions in South Africa started with students saying that they were opposed to learning Afrikaans in school, right? They were opposed to a curriculum that was dead to them. They wanted a curriculum that meant something to their future, not being indoctrinated, to use the correct term of the word, in a language that had no future. So I think kind of bouncing off of that, Dee has a great question in the chat about, don't we at some point have to talk about what is the purpose of learning? What are schools for? And so I'm going to toss that question out to the three of you, and then let you knock that around for a little while, because it is really at the heart of the matter.
Absolutely.
I know it's a big question. Take your time.
So, I mean, I think the education that we're talking about is education for liberation, right? Are you teaching students about how the world has worked, how it continues to work? Just like Jesse said with the Freire quote about reading the world. Are you reading the world in a way that takes into account all the perspectives that were left out of the Constitutional Convention? Or are you just reading the world through a really narrow lens that obscures all those perspectives, right? And so, you know, it wasn't so long ago that we were so obsessed with this idea of 21st century skills and critical thinking, right? Remember that? We were talking about that before the pandemic. And I don't think there's anything wrong with teaching young folks or getting young folks to practice being critical thinking about race, right? So critical thinking, if it's on the table, if we see it as a value, if we think that it's important to learning, why should race be off the table and racism be off the table as something to which we apply critical thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the purpose of education and the stark contrast between those in power and their view of education and those of us who have a liberatory view of education was really driven home for me when my son started kindergarten, because he started at a public school that was being renamed because it was becoming an international school with language immersion. So they had a big ceremony at the school, and they brought in all these politicians and school board members, and all the kids were assembled on the grass on the front lawn, and the students did some amazing cultural performances, and then the politicians got to speaking, and the governor's aide took the podium and said, "I want to congratulate you all for coming to this school, because now your kids will be prepared to compete in the global economy." And cheers did not erupt from the third grade section. I wasn't like in the back, like, yes, now my kid can get a job instead of like some kid in Mexico, right? Like that, they want us to think that the purpose of education is this endless competition and to help, the capitalist class in this country enrich themselves, right, through global competition. But we have a different vision. And we have to have a different vision of education because we face such incredible crises today. We have all these overlapping crises. We have a global pandemic, and our very lives are at threat. We have a crisis of mass incarceration where more Black people are in prison on probation or parole than were enslaved on plantations in 1850. We have a crisis for women in this country where 1 in 3 face sexual assault, and now women's right to choose abortion is being eroded and is in grave peril right now. We have a crisis of wealth inequality in our country where you have like 5 people have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet, right? And climate change is giving us a very short clock in order to solve all these problems, because scientists say if the climate increases by 3 degrees, it will trigger runaway climate change that's irreversible, right? And we have already seen the impacts of climate change very real with the storms and the wildfires that are taking lives. And so if education is not about identifying problems in our society and finding collective solutions to them, then it's irrelevant to our students' lives. So we have to transform education to be about meeting the needs of our kids and solving these very real crises. And so I think we should actually completely reorganize schools so that kids aren't going to school to just study math and science and reading and writing and the subjects. But what if we instead, they went to a class that was like called "Should We Defund the Police?" And then in that class, they studied the history of where police came from. So they're learning social studies and history. And they found out the police came from slave patrols, right? And then in that class, they studied math by looking at the budgets in the cities and looking like in Seattle, over $400 million goes to the police budget, and comparing that to the minuscule amounts that go to education, right? And then thinking about percentages and thinking about budgets and all other kinds of aspects of math come into it, right? So they could read books about police violence, and they could write essays and make presentations to the city council on their conclusions. And then we're doing problem-based learning that can actually solve the problems that we face in our society.
Hey, Jeff, I wanted to just jump in because I know our time is winding up.
Yeah.
And eliminate one point. A lot of these laws have in them specific bans against civic participation as part of education. And that's a huge part of what education should be about, and that we should be pushing to make education about. And so I think we can model a pushback against those kind of bans by getting ready for 2022 and the gauntlet that has been thrown down that says school boards are going to be battlegrounds, that they're going to try and recall people who are allies to anti-racism education, that they're going to try and elect people who are part of this right-wing project that we've been talking about. And so as communities, we have to decide what we're going to do about that. So who are the educators who can run in your districts? Who are the community groups and parent groups who can get together and support those people? Who can support the people who are being threatened with a recall because they've supported a curriculum initiative that teaches the truth? And so that's the sort of civic education we need to model as adults, and to encourage to be at the center of the type of learning that goes on in schools.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And civic education, after all, was one of the purposes of public education that were enumerated and by the people who wrote our founding documents. That's what they said education was for. Just to respond to what Jesse said about competing in a global economy, that's not what the purpose of education was about when it was first conceived by the people who founded this country. So if the civic education is no longer a goal, according to these conservatives and radical right-wingers, then aren't they really rejecting the people who wrote the founding documents? So yes, very good point. We've got about a minute left. I'm going to give each of you just 20 seconds to say something, and then that will wrap it up for us.
I'll just add to this question of, what is schooling for? I think part of the narrative fight that preceded where we are with CRT is this question of freedom in education, and freedom of individual choice is the narrative that's been pushed by those who are now using CRT to privatize public education. And that is the kind of pitting individuals against individuals in competition aspect that Jesse spoke to. But we believe that we should come from a place of abundance in thinking about our schools, and that there's enough for everyone to have the liberatory education system that is not about controlling students, but really is about bringing them into a multiracial democracy. And that is really what freedom looks like in education. And so I think that's what I'll end with. Thank you so much for having me as part of this discussion.
Terrific point to close out on. Any other points? Because I think.
Thanks, everybody. Again, I always learn so much from each of you, so I appreciate that. Yes, education for liberation that gets us to global cooperation is what we ought to be aiming and shooting for.
Yeah, right on. Thank you so much. I was taking notes during everybody's talk. I'm working on a new book about this struggle, and I really appreciated all the wisdom you guys dropped, and I hope to see everybody in the struggle on October 14th.
We're with you, Jesse. Thanks for everybody for having us on, and thank you for all the panelists. Take care.